Hey, Duke's here, and we are about to start the show. But before we start it, I want to just send a thank you to anybody who has given us a rating or review on your podcast app, and for those of you who've reached out with some constructive criticism about the show. One of the things that many of you have said is we could stand to speed up the plot recap a bit and to organize it a bit better. And we have heard that criticism. We agree with you, and we have implemented it. However, it may be a while before you notice that because we're working something like 8 episodes ahead right now. So we have made that change, but it'll be a while before you hear it. So bear with us in the meantime. And if you need to skip past the opening ramble or the plot recap, you're not going to hurt our feelings. We won't even know. For this episode, if you want to skip the opening ramble, skip to about 6.5 minutes. If you want to skip our epic, convoluted plot recap, you're going to want to skip to about 28 minutes in. All right, let's start the show.
If the manifest of ingredients on the bottle had been legible, it would have read something like this: water, blackstrap molasses, imported habanero peppers, salt, garlic, ginger, tomato puree, axle grease, real hickory smoke, snuff, butts of clove cigarettes, Guinness stout fermentation dregs, uranium mill tailings, muffler cores, monosodium glutamate, nitrates, nitrites.
Did you get to where they end up in Dovetail?
Rita is at the moment one of my most favorite characters in the book.
Yeah.
Like, I think you would live in Dovetail. I would. Jesse would live in Dovetail. That is where he would be, sort of making things, like real things that exist from real products, because he enjoys doing that.
I do enjoy doing that, although I'm wondering where I would. I'm also not an anti-technologist though, too. So I don't know where I would fit in this particular world, to be honest. There is a moment where Neal says, "Oh, so you don't want to live like the Victorians, and yet you rely on their ability to make a lot of money for your lifestyle," or something like that. And Neal is it? Rita's embarrassed, and it just it reminds me of actually something I think is very common where you live in Portland and Pacific Northwest, a kind of Stephenson in latter books has commented on this. I think what he calls steel collar workers. So people who essentially use older technologies to forge or fabricate nice things for wealthy people. And I know a few people who make their living that way too. And there is, or even, people we've known in our past, say, who are timber framers or specialize in draft horse logging or something like that. And I really admire people who have those trades, and they do. There is a sort of reliance, though, on sort of people who are existing more in the capitalistic, technologized world, being willing to pay for those services these days too. And I do think Stephenson's pointing out a little bit of hypocrisy in that moment there too, which is there is a tendency for the people who are intentionally craftspeople in order to maintain a certain lifestyle to kind of sometimes maybe look down on the people who they rely on completely for their well-being.
Yes, a good point. Before I'm super excited to talk about this book, as we sort of talked about earlier. But how are you? You are still going through a series of, sort of like life reordering. How is that going a few days later?
I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night really stressed out. The fun story I feel like that you would enjoy, though, is yesterday I was the entertainment at a 4-year-old's birthday party. And I was a singing skeleton who drove my camper. I drove my camper all the way across town. I don't ever want to do this again, actually, because it was way too much driving, to a northern suburb of Chicago. And it was a Halloween-themed birthday party, which in and of itself is hilarious. On October 1st. For my friend Lulu, who is also a podcast host of some renown.
Wait, the Lulu that I'm like thinking of?
There are a couple of
like,
well-known Lulus, but my friend is one of the well-known Lulus.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Like, definitely if you operate in like podcast listening circles, like you will definitely cotton on to like, wait, like there's several Lulus. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm so impressed. You were a singing skeleton at the aforementioned, but not totally identified Lulu, famous podcaster and radio
Lulu
personage.
actually was the hype witch. So I was a singing skeleton, which is actually what we decided is actually what Lulu does for a living extremely well. We sang
I'm a hype witch.
Exactly. We sang a modified version of Down by the Bay that was, I came up with this, Down by the Graves, where the pumpkins grow, which featured then a lot of sort of rhymes like, have you ever seen a ghoul jump in the pool? Have you ever seen my favorite that I came up with is, have you ever seen a scarecrow fixing her hair dough?
Oh, very nice.
With a kind of Appalachian accent. Have you ever seen a skeleton riding on a Peloton?
Little present day, little post day.
Little post.
I like it.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. So, are there any photos or video of this?
There are in fact photos and video. I could forward you some if you want.
Please. Yeah. I would love that.
Yeah, it's actually very, once again, redolent of the place we used to work, too. It was a very kind of campfire-y sort of experience.
Well, having renamed my company Campfire, I obviously have, no qualms about that. The past,
it's... we would say, Campfire!
Campfire! That's how I should definitely, that's what I should do. I have to go to a happy hour this afternoon. Which is funny given my history with drinking. And maybe I will surprise my business partner by when we arrive at the happy hour, simply going, Campfire!
Sounds like a guy. I endorse that plan.
Awesome. Let's get into this book.
Diamond Age?
Yeah, okay. I really want to talk Diamond Age. I am so excited to talk about this book.
Well, I think you started plot recap last time, so maybe I'll start this one.
Okay. Boy, this is going to be hard.
It's a hard one. I'm definitely like rethinking our whole like no notes plot recap, or even like sort of even vague notes. But
or if we keep it much bigger.
I try to just say what you need to know to get to the next thing. But sometimes you get just, it's too fun to just wallow in the details, especially with Stephenson, because there's so many details to wallow in. But it's also just Stephenson's plots are rarely simple. So the book starts out actually with a wonderful first chapter, I think, centered on a young man named Bud, who is kind of stupid and kind of an asshole. And he is getting a skull gun, which shoots nano projectiles mounted into his head, basically so he can, engage in low-key criminal acts. Or I'm not sure if that was the exact plan, but he quickly realizes that that's something he can do. Oh, and he's racist, too, because it's a black man who's afraid of him, and he particularly enjoys the fear in the eyes of the black man. So just a kind of a total... piece of shit is Bud. And pretty shortly, so he's going around robbing people and making a little money and feeling good about himself, and he picks the wrong family. I don't remember if this happens after the island growing chapter, too. I'm getting a little bit confused.
This is after that, because the island growing chapter
so I'm kind of skipping ahead. And
it's okay, yeah.
All right. Well, I'll finish Bud's tale, and you can back up to the island hopping thing, then, or the island creation.
Well, I know you are I know you are interested in Bud's tale because it's here in the rundown as what is this doing here? So I can tell that this was important to you.
Yeah, well, and and actually, I think I know the answer to that question, but I didn't necessarily understand it very quickly. So anyway, Bud robs the wrong people who turn out to be Ashantis from Africa, and they are a economically successful ethnic group who also hold a grudge, and they seek out Bud. And they capture him and take him before a magistrate. I did skip a chapter or two sticking with Bud's plot, so I'll throw it back to you, and maybe you can fill in the missing chapter or two.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a way to approach this plot summary is to kind of identify sort of the big players.
That's a good idea.
The New Atlantans. Who are and their outpost in this area is called Source Victoria, and they are basically neo-Victorians. They call themselves New Atlantans. People who don't like them very much call them Vickies.
Source Victoria is a floating city or an elevated city.
I believe
it seems like it's somehow it's on stilts, or it's held up. It's up in the air.
Yeah,
although I don't fully understand.
It is vaguely up in the air because we know later that you can get from Dovetail to Source Victoria by walking uphill through the dog pod. And if you keep going downhill, you will eventually get either into the leased territories or to the causeway that will take you to the leased territories. But again, so there is that. There are the leased territories, which this is a wonderful accident of listening instead of reading. In listening, I heard it as Least, as in, yes, the least of something.
Which is also true.
And then, which is a very Stephenson-y thing. But it is actually the least, Leased territories. Nobody really seems to know to whom they are leased or whom they are from leased. But that, I think, is intentional. There's also the Middle Kingdom part. I wasn't quite sure of if the Middle Kingdom is a kind of religious term for this earth that we are on, or this particular existence. Because
I think the Middle Kingdom is mainland China as opposed to Shanghai, which is the coastal
republics.
The coastal republic. So I think once you get like 30 or 40 miles inland, you're now in the Middle Kingdom. And there might be other sort of ethnically Chinese republics as well, as far as we know. Like whatever happened to Hong Kong in this alternate timeline.
Maybe it was swallowed, or who knows. But we have the Chinese coastal republics, which is basically Shanghai. We have the Middle Kingdom, which is mainland and political China. We have the New Atlantans, and we have the leased territories. Those are the four major areas of the book, and they also map to kind of the major players in the book that we get. We have characters from each of those areas that we meet in this first half of the book. John Percival Hackworth, our New Atlantan or Victorian or neo-Victorian hero, semi-hero.
Named similarly to hero protagonist in a way. His name is a very obvious pun.
Yeah. So he is kind of our major player in that area. We have Nell and Harv, who were the two children of the Bud that you just named. They find themselves, Nell in particular, in possession of a book that John Percival Hackworth makes that is intended to educate young ladies. He is kind of asked to do that by a very important person in the New Atlantan government. Having a young daughter himself, he compiles a version for his daughter Fiona. He loses that book, and it ends up in Nell and Harv's hands.
Illicitly. He steals the data, basically.
Nell and Harv are Nell is basically our main character, with Harv a very important secondary main character. And then we have Judge Feng, who kind of, for most of the first half of the book, is a magistrate of the Chinese coastal republics, and finds himself entangled with first Bud, and then Harv and John Percival Hackworth. And then our final major character, Dr. X, which I love it. You can picture Stephenson somewhere in the mid-90s being like, what should I call these guys? Shit, whatever, Dr. X. Like, we'll just roll with it.
No, yeah, it's like a comic book character name, but you're given a plausible explanation too and which later becomes even more interesting too as we learn more about this character. He's maybe the most fascinating character in the book.
One thing I wonder about Stephenson is if he starts with jokes and works backwards through the plausibility to come up with interesting backstories and plots, or if he comes up with the character first and then works his way forward to the joke. And then basically the plot of this whole first half of the book is that John Percival Hackworth illicitly makes this Young Ladies Illustrated primer, which is basically an animated educational device, loses it.
It's a tablet. It's like it's a really smart iPad with a nice leather binder.
And then most of the first half of the book is a MacGuffin, with the Young Ladies Illustrated primer being, well, the MacGuffin. And we discover along the way that Dr. X actually turns out to be interested in the widespread education of about 250,000 disenfranchised female Chinese babies. And he kind of corners Judge Feng into helping him with that. And John Percival Hackworth, who is our sort of hapless protagonist, goes through a series of one-way plot devices that steadily narrow his narrative and life, I'm assuming, potential along the way to the first half of the book. Lots of shenanigans, and primarily the education of Nell occur. And she is eventually freed from her abusive mother and series of abusive mother's boyfriends, all of whom, except for one or two, I believe, are 3-letter name men.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think is another funny little thing. The one of the few redeeming, well, it's not totally true because the worst of them is named Bert, but the best of them is named Brad. But there is a Tad, a Raj, a Bud, a Matt. It's this wonderful parade of bland male names.
Almost like Stephenson was still living in Boston, hanging out at a tavern, like looking for inspiration.
I know, it's a wonder none of them are named Sean.
Right.
Since I kind of did the plot, do you want to talk a little bit about like the technology that runs through?
Sure. No, I like the way you did that, because now we don't have to go chapter by chapter, because you kind of laid out the entire scenario. And it is, Hackworth is being pulled through the scenario, kind of like the reader, haplessly the entire time. And also like the reader, not always quite sure what's going on. So the scenario is that all these the different sort of localities that you refer to also contain enclaves within them that are kind of dominated by different ethnic / religious / philosophical / vocational groups that they call files, spelled with a PH, and that so you have the different countries and you have the different files which are engaged in trade with one another and occasional cooperation and liaisoning, but also kind of low-key warfare at all time, it seemed like, in competition too. And the warfare is largely conducted by nanotechnology, nanosites. And so the more powerful territories like Source Victoria or Shanghai, all of they are, and I guess I don't really know how New Chuzan fits into this, if it's all a leased territory or if it's divided up among the files. I don't fully understand the organization, but that you essentially, there are kind of these fleets of Sentry miniature blimps that form boundaries between these territories, and a human, if they're not permitted, can kind of just push the blimps out of the way and walk through if they're allowed to do that. But the blimps are surveilling and emitting, as I understand it, lots of nanotechnology, which they call nanosites, singular nanosite, or is it nanophyte? Nanosite, right?
Nanocytes.
Yeah, nanosite. And they'll sometimes refer to them as mites, too. And especially
or pods, or there's all sorts of wonderful little slangy terms for them.
So there seems to be this kind of ongoing low-key warfare between the nanocytes. Every now and again, the warfare gets so bad that you get kind of what they call toner, which is kind of like gray dust that is potentially toxic, although it doesn't seem that bad. I mean, you definitely don't want it getting into your lungs, but nor would you want coal dust getting into your lungs. And that is a bunch of dead nanocytes, because some of these entities are at war with one another. There's also a kind of economic agreement between all these entities. So even though they all have their own legal system, there's also kind of a shared legal system as well, that liaisons between their legal system. And I forget what that's called exactly, but it comes into play here and there. And the least territories, as you mentioned earlier, are kind of in the boundaries between the areas. And then they're the areas that are not as well defended by the nanocentries. So you have these kind of like the people who live, say, in New Atlantis have a really good defense ring perimeter around them, and the least territories are kind of nearer the perimeter. And the people who are actually, citizens or members of that file, the New Victorians, seem to be safer because they're closer to the kind of the center, farther from the sort of the area where the nano battle seems to be happening.
They have a stronger, basically immunocytes system.
Right. It seems like the least territories are in the area where the nano wars are often taking place, too. And it does seem like very rarely do these wars get to the point of actually leading to mass casualties and death, although there are, I think, occasional assassinations. I'm trying to think of what else we need to know about this territory. I mean, we know that the coastal Chinese, like Shanghai territory, is controlled by a fairly brutal and efficient Confucian justice system, of which Judge Fang is a participant, and he has rather extreme powers, to say find people guilty or torture them. Luckily for the people who come before Judge Fang, in most cases he's generally pretty relatively compassionate and obliged towards his duties, which is not to say that he's not capable of being quite harsh when he needs to be, but he's not corrupt. He takes his job very, very seriously. And I don't know. I feel like you gave us a really good setup of everything that happened. I guess the only other sort of plot thing that you need to know is Dr. X figures out that Hackworth has, he hasn't figured it out. Hackworth actually works with Dr. X to perpetuate this theft. And when Hackworth loses the book, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. X is interested in also obtaining it, and he has leverage against Hackworth, so he's sort of working with Hackworth to try to obtain this book. But some of the new Victorians, including, I can't remember the Lord's name, the guy from Iowa.
Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw.
Finkel-McGraw.
Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw. Miscegenation being one of Stevenson's, tropes and obsessions that he just can't get away from. A ethnically Chinese man who was adopted and raised in Iowa, and then was a very successful technologist, I think early on in the nanotechnology development. He and another sort of member of the intelligence service enlist Hackworth as a secret service to pretend to be going along with Dr. X and Dr. X's efforts to get the primer. But in fact, they've promised him that if he gives them information on Dr. X, that not only will they not prosecute him, they'll actually reward him handsomely. So he's sort of he will
acting as a double agent.
He'll end up knighted. He believes.
He's very much concerned with his daughter Fiona's future too, and wants her wants her to be very, very successful, and that is kind of his chief motivation. And I think we understand that he's a brilliant engineer. He works for one of the leading firms. He also seems like naive and even stupid in some ways too. He's not very good at the machinations that he gets up to, but he's a brilliant engineer.
He's what you want as that character,
right?
Like a brilliant character motivated by familial duty, who just he can't turn the high beams on. He's he just lurches from one bad decision to the next in like an ever ascending group of, he's just a pawn that keeps moving up the ladder. And I can't remember from reading it, 20 years ago. But from the sense of the way that things usually go for characters like that, I can't really imagine too many great things for John Percival Hackworth, but we'll see.
Yeah, he may kind of blunder through with a sort of fool's luck, right?
Right.
He may land on his feet. And the first half of the book ends in where he has been sent to essentially North America, and I think the Pacific Northwest, to do some kind of mission for Dr. X. I don't think I quite figured out why he was sent there. But as he's doing that, he's still reporting in to Finkel McGraw and the other Victorian, and some of these nanosites that he programmed several years ago when he lost the book have let him know that the book has been found. It's on the move. And this is because Nell, the young girl being raised by the book, and Harv have, as you said, escaped their abusive family situation. They've left, they're now out of doors, sort of wandering around, kind of like homeless people, and they end up being taken in by a colony of artisans who work with their hands, called Dovetail, which of course is a kind of woodworking joint. People who build things like chairs and wrought iron rails and watches, one assumes, and things like that.
Paper.
And paper.
Real paper. Because one of the technological things in this particular world is that nothing is really made anymore. It comes out of these large things called matter compilers, or marvelously MCs.
MCs, right? Which are 3D printers, basically.
Yeah, which are 3D printers with all of the kinks worked out, really.
Yeah.
There is a hilarious early scene in the book where Nell compiles a whole bunch of mattresses for all of her stuffed animals, and her brother Harv, who I assume there is probably some general, probably small fee for doing this kind of matter compiling. This is like another thing that Neal Stephenson imagined before it would happen. But like 8-year-old children finding a way to break into their parents' media systems and just like downloading like thousands of dollars of media. That's how most things are made in this world, including, as we find in an early scene, an island for Princess Elizabeth.
Princess Elizabeth, the daughter of Queen Victoria II.
The second.
So possibly someone who may go on to be Queen Elizabeth III.
The third, one would assume.
Although that hasn't happened yet.
The island itself is going to, after her birthday party, disappear. It is going to sort of, there's this great little moment where it's kind of a throwaway. But I found... And this kind of goes into my first few points, which we'll get to in a few minutes, I think. But I just found the writing of the first few pages and chapters of this book so unbelievably beautiful and dense that I really enjoyed lingering in them, and the description of that island in particular. But you have a question about Bud's plot.
Yeah, and I wrote this a couple weeks ago. The first time I read Bud's plot, and spoiler, Judge Fang sentences him to death for what he does in a scene that is both, sort of sad, but also kind of funny, too. Part of the humor comes from one of Neal Stephenson's favorite kinds of cultural ironies, which is the irony of mismatching accent to ethnic identity. So Judge Fang, even though he is racially Chinese, grew up in New York and has a kind of like New York Brooklyn accent. But although he is a magistrate and a judge in Shanghai, and the whole backstory there. I guess the other thing we should this is an era. This seems to be set in the middle of the 21st century, maybe 2050 or something like that, it's an era of hyper immigration. It just seems like wherever you go, everybody's there. That's not really explained, other than one has the sense there's some kind of economic motivation. But it seems like, there might be traditional Chinese control of the Chinese mainland, but there are also just about every other ethnicity or racial group you can imagine has found its way to the coast of China at this point, and apparently also the Pacific Northwest. We learn later too. So
it's one of his obsessions is the idea of failed states giving way to extraterritorial enclaves.
Right.
Like this world could be the world of Snow Crash. Fast forwarded another 50 years. I mean, he even uses the term claves. But yeah, he likes nothing so much as this idea of physically small areas that have their own particular political charter. And so you can go past like a Maoist enclave in Shanghai, and then right after that, another kind of enclave where members of those enclaves could potentially have political asylum.
Well, it's funny. You actually just articulated one of my other questions for you, which is, do you think this book is in the same continuity as Snow Crash? So maybe we'll start with that.
I don't think it is. I think that insofar as it springs from the same brain that is obsessed with the same ideas, and also like refreshingly not worried about being obsessed with the same ideas. I think everybody hears that old trope that all writers only have one story and are continually finding different ways to retell it. I think Stephenson rises above that, but I do think he does have a series of things that fascinate and obsess him. And it feels different than the world of Snow Crash. The world of Snow Crash feels a little grimier and a little more anarchic and a little less well ordered. Which I think fits with one of the big themes of this book, which is the clash of enthalpy and entropy.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I do think you could imagine if this book was set in the same continuity as Snow Crash, then the time in which Snow Crash was taking place would be thought of as sort of a dark age, that this sort of new order emerged out of. But I also think that Snow Crash is, generally speaking, more cartoonish. This book feels like it is maybe set in a future that might be a little more plausible. I still don't think it's super plausible, but that the degree of fantasy is ratcheted down a little bit. I think for this book too. Question about Bud plot, which is just sort of like, Bud dies within, 50 pages or something like that. Yes, his kids become major characters. But why do you think this book starts with Bud's story? Since he's not a character who we follow for a very long time, and nor does much that he do really, apart from impregnating his girlfriend, affect future events.
His girlfriend.
Which really...
Tequila.
Anybody with 3 letters in their first name could have done, And
there's actually like Bud, sort of hilariously and sadly for him, doesn't really even know if he is Nell's father.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
I reread the chapter where he dies, and it's like that last moment is actually genuinely sad.
Yeah. I think, in a lot, hopefully, I think we'll talk about this. I really do think this is the book where Stephenson as a writer grows up and some of the like sort of wonderful set pieces and moments of like imagination that we see in Zodiac and Snow Crash for sure are married to a real emotional robustness. And I mean, thinking back to my memories of reading this book in the 90s, I really remembered this moment of Bud, but probably because it was the first part of the book. There's one other moment of the book that I really remember that we haven't gotten to yet. And so I'm beginning to suspect it wasn't from this book. It's from somewhere else.
Does it involve colored condoms?
It doesn't. I did listen to that part today, and I was like, my God. Like, I was like, crap, we're going to have to research a whole bunch of like Etruscan fertility rituals and stuff for the next episode. Like,
coming up next episode, listener.
Right. So many fertility rituals. Are they offensive or not? Are they problematic or not? Anyway, next episode.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have an answer for you. I think there's another Deliberator chapter that is not Bud's story, but like with Stephenson, we always do get one of these chapters that brings us into the world like in media res, and he's pretty not nostalgic about those characters. He is very happy, like Hero as the Deliberator. As soon as the car is trashed, the Deliberator is dead.
Hero is reborn as a 30-something failed software engineer. Which is what the Deliberator was all along, but it's
exactly
sort of like a new character hatches out of the ashes of the Deliberator.
Out of the exploding car in the swimming pool. Yep. Yeah, I don't know. I think it is important. We do get to meet Judge Fang and his hilarious sidekicks, who are important as well. But I think it does have to be here. And I think he does a pretty good job of setting it up, knocking it down, and moving on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a strong start. Maybe not quite as strong of a start as the Deliberator, but it's memorable. And I do think you are even that chapter plus the island creation chapter, which I think are right after each other. Those two chapters give you the world, and they're both pretty memorable and just sort of like Judge Fang's style of justice, which is, the evidence compiled against Bud is pretty obvious, but has no chance to argue for himself. Basically, once the evidence is presented, Judge Fang takes a second, rubs his temples, and then says, "You're guilty." And then 30 seconds later, Bud has left the courtroom and his body explodes. Which I think is painless. I hope is painless. And, Judge Fang moves on to the next juvenile delinquent who has assaulted some, family or something like that. And you get the sense that this is happening all the time. These are the sort of cultural encounters that this kind of workaday judge and his hilarious sidekicks are dealing with. So, yeah, I think it just brings you into the world super, super well. But it was, when I was reading it, I did have that same sense of like, what's this doing here? Why don't we just start with Nell? Nell is the most interesting character. And actually, we didn't say this in our recap, but to me, I think what's so great about this book and what I really enjoy this time around, which I think I read it in my mid or early 20s, is I just love the pedagogy of the primer and Nell. Nell, this super book is educating Nell by telling her a series of stories that are based on myths and based on kind of like grim fairy tales. And the book is observing her circumstances and is smart enough. It's driven by, I think, what they call a pseudo-intelligence, which is like an artificial intelligence. And the pseudo-intelligence, or maybe it's a system of independent pseudo-intelligences that Hackworth has sort of hacked together into a kind of, because it sounds like he was responsible for the engineering of the book, is very aware of Nell's physical and emotional challenges. She has a very, very tough life. Harv, her brother, is kind of her protector, but he can only protect her so much. And she has these, stuffed animal toys, and the book just creates this wonderful world of imagination about Princess Nell and her animal toys, including one of whom is a dinosaur, and we get a wonderful chapter that's just dinosaurs survival story, which is a wonderful, great little short story all into itself. Yeah, and we're meant to understand that the book is generating this based on some kind of like patterns and mythic things, but according to the inputs it's getting from Nell, but also it's smart enough to tell that Nell's in danger and she needs emotional support. She's also being taught martial arts. She's also being taught to speak like a Victorian, which is very, very important in this world because language and class... language is a marker of class, and so if you speak like a Victorian, people will treat you like a Victorian and treat you at least as though you deserve more respect than a, say, street urchin does. Yeah. And so to me, those are just my favorite moments in the entire book up to this, at least this first part too. And this way, I think to me, it's what makes it a really great book and not just a kind of fun sci-fi, not just another kind of like rollicking sci-fi parody romp, which it has elements of.
I really as I put in our notes, I am deeply embarrassed about my estimation of this book when I read it in high school, which was it's not as fun as Snow Crash. and I'm so disappointed that I didn't pay more attention. Because there is so much going on in this book that is wonderful and important, and I really want to between this session and next session, go and read some of the reviews that the Diamond Age got, because I don't think it was received as positively as Snow Crash was, and I don't think that's fair.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's much better than I remember. I don't know that I would quite put it at the level of Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon based on my memory, although we're not through with it yet. It's denser than Snow Crash, and you have to work a little harder to follow it than Snow Crash, which might be some of the reason for what you're describing, particularly if you were a younger reader.
Oh my God, yeah. And I think we have a few readings.
Do you want to do a reading?
We want to get to. Yeah, this first one is mostly about the density of the prose. His diction is unbelievably heightened in this book, but then also, like Stephenson does in general, there are flights of beauty and then reminders that the body is always here and that we are physical and there is blood and viscera and shit, which I just think is really good and responsible and marvelous. This is the second chapter of the book. So this one is Source Victoria, description of its environs. Source Victoria's air intakes erupted from the summit of the Royal Ecological Conservatory like a spray of 100-meter-long calla lilies. Below, the analogy was perfected by an inverted tree of root-like plumbing that spread fractally through the diamondoid bedrock of New Chuzan, terminating in the warm water of the South China Sea as numberless capillaries arranged in a belt around the smart coral reef several dozen meters beneath the surface. One big, huge pipe gulping up seawater would have done roughly the same thing, just as the lilacs could have been replaced by one howling maw, birds and litter whacking into a bloody grid somewhere before they could gum up the works. But it wouldn't have been ecological. The geotechs of imperial tectonics would not have known an ecosystem if they'd been living in the middle of one. But they did know that ecosystems were especially tiresome when they got foobarred. So they protected the environment with the same implacable, plodding, green-visored mentality that they applied to designing overpasses and culverts. Thus, water seeped into Source Victoria through microtubes, much the same way it seeped into a beach, and air wafted into it silently down the artfully skewed, exponential horns of those thrusting calla lilies, each horn a point in parameter space not awfully far from some central ideal. They were strong enough to withstand typhoons, but flexible enough to rustle in a breeze. Birds, wandering inside, sensed a gradient in the air, pulling them down into night, and simply chose to fly out. They didn't even get scared enough to shit. There's echoes of the Deliberator's suit, that perspiration wafting through it like a freshly napalmed forest. And we're kind of Stephenson at his best, at his most lyrical. And this is a dense passage. I mean, you really have to track the syntax of that second sentence in particular of that first paragraph, because the verb in it was perfected by. And then you have to read the rest of the sentence to figure out what it was perfected by. And it's pretty marvelous. It employs a lot of Victorian tropes of literature, but at the same time, he's also attaching it to this kind of very 21st century way of writing that is remarkable. And I just really, listening to that, I had to listen to it a few times, and I was like, fuck, that's good. And then I went and read it and was like, oh, it's even better when you read it.
I listened to it a couple times, and just now I finally got the visual of the first sentence. It took me 3 times, which is, and it's not that Source Victoria is a floating city. It's that Source Victoria is kind of like on a mountain or a hill, but part of the same artificial island, New Chuzan, that includes the leased territories as well. And I hadn't really fully processed what the relationship of Source Victoria to the rest of New Chuzan was. It's the same landmass, and you get it from the pipes making their way, and I assume because it's diamond, you can see the infrastructure too, which is also kind of brilliant and beautiful, although oddly not very Victorian. The Victorians did not like to see their water and their shit and piss, and where it was going. If you look at Victorian houses, there's all sorts of elaborate, the servants enter a different way, and the cooking happens and in a the kitchen, there are no open floor plan kitchens. The guests do not see the cooking, and the food in many cases passes through a lazy Susan or a dumbwaiter or something, such that there would be no possibility that a guest would even see something as disorderly and disreputable as cooking. So that's kind of interesting too. But yeah,
I do think one of the central conflicts of this book is the question of entropy and enthalpy. Are we heading towards order or disorder? And what is brilliant about this book is that any novel has to head towards disorder. You cannot write a novel that is narratively interesting that heads. Well, it can resolve in order, right? That often the end of the book is order being achieved, but you have to go through disorder to get there, right? True. Yeah, and that's when we get. So that's comedy, right? Right. So we end in marriage. So we do get to order through wild disorder, or we get to wild disorder, and that's drama.
Or disorder, I think drama, maybe I'm wrong about this, you've studied this more, but I think tragedy or drama can still end in order, but it's often a new, sadder order, right?
Oh, yeah. It's an order that doesn't include a lot of the people that we care previously about. Part of the order.
Right. Or even if it does, they have lost something. They've been changed in some way that is sad.
But the epigraph of this book is, by nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they get to be wide apart. And I think that is an interesting epigraph because it leaves open the questions of, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And I think those are the questions that Stephenson is posing to us as we go through this book.
Yeah. I'm remembering the epigraphs of The Sun Also Rises, which is the first one, I think, is "You Are a Lost Generation," Gertrude Stein in correspondence to Hemingway, and then "The Sun Also Rises," which I think is a quote from the Bible, but also maybe a response to "You Are a Lost Generation." Too.
Cool.
I have another reading I have several readings I want to do. I'm not sure we'll get to them all tonight, but actually that reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you. So earlier I described this world, this scenario, as being perhaps in a similar scenario as Snow Crash, but Snow Crash being kind of a dark age, and this being a more stable era that emerged. I don't think that's what Stephenson is indicating. I think it's its own continuity. But even if that were the case, question I keep batting back and forth in my head is this a utopian novel or is it a dystopian novel?
Oh, do you want me to try to answer that?
Yeah.
I find this to be a dystopian novel. I think that it's what happens. It's like if we're in latter stage, like capitalism right now, this to me strikes me as end stage capitalism. Though I'm interested to see in the second half of the book if Dr. X's efforts to re-educate basically an entire generation of disenfranchised female Chinese babies might end up bringing about some sort of new world order. But the fracturing of communities, the reliance of all of that upon economies, and then the further stratification of wealth, this strikes to me as a more subtle and nuanced dystopia than Snow Crash was, which is just like wow. I mean, it's just a disaster.
Yeah.
But I would not want to live in this world.
Yeah, I don't think my answer to my own question, I think, is that it's actually neither, because to me it feels equally. It seems like to me it feels similarly to have a mixture of chaos and order, and certain benefits of technology, recent technology being available to all that our current age has, which in the sense that it seems to me that technology has solved some of the nagging issues of poverty in this scenario, in that there's free food available and it seems like shelter is affordable, and you can get a blanket from a free matter replicator. Then there's free medicine available too. And so some of the challenges of poverty, it seems like, have been solved, and yet there still is tremendous poverty. And if anything, the social classes seem even harder to transcend than they are now, or at least similarly hard. There's great wealth, there's great poverty, and what many people, at least all of our protagonists, are engaged in is actually trying to, either in a small way for selfish reasons or in a large way for unselfish reasons, they're all struggling with social class, basically, and restricted opportunity. Hackworth is not trying to get his invention, which is a book that can educate anybody and give them the abilities they need to succeed in this world. Hackworth's not trying to get that to everybody, although it is interesting when Hackworth discovers that somebody has been using the book. His first impulse is that it should not be taken away from her. Right. I don't know if you remember that detail, but that's a moment of Hackworth showing good character in that moment. Even though he doesn't know this girl, he doesn't think that the book should be taken away. But then you have other characters who are saying, "Oh, if such a thing exists, we need." In this case, what is it? 500,000 semi-abandoned infants, trying to get them educated. I mean, all of these characters are trying to struggle with limited opportunity and a oppressive class system. Even though there are technological wonders, and even technological wonders that are available to all. If it's a dystopia, then maybe we're in a dystopia too, which we might be.
I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, for sure. I mean, the one thing that we have over this world is that we are not yet living in a police state. And this is a police state. There, everything is recorded, everything is surveilled.
Right.
The surveillance allows the social structures to remain in place and allows Judge Fang, in his own words, to be judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah. One reading I wanted to do, and one observation, this is interesting. So Finkel-McGraw, the equity lord, at one point, we get a little bio of him, and he's interesting. He grew up in Iowa, and I believe he even went to the same university Stephenson lived in the town. I think Stephenson lived in Ames as a teenager, and Finkel-McGraw went to the university that's in Ames.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and Finkel-McGraw at one point, there's a direct statement, and I don't have this passage, unfortunately, but I think I have it almost memorized, which is it's something like Finkel-McGraw developed a philosophy which was iconoclastic at the time he grew up, which might be the 1990s, at a time of sort of cultural relativism and kind of celebration of multiculturalism and diversity, which was that some cultures are simply better than others. That racism, biological racism, is wrong and stupid. Humans are all the same. But some cultures are simply better than others. This is not a question of taste, or it is objectively observable because some cultures conquer others and others die out. And, this is a very direct, very explicit expression of cultural racism. And that intrigued me because Stephenson is very circumspect about his politics, and he's interested in anthropology, and he's interested in race, and I think it can be tempting to suspect that maybe Stephenson is also dabbling in cultural racism. There's a later passage where Finkel-McGraw makes an argument in favor of hypocrisy, or not exactly in favor of hypocrisy, but voicing a preference for hypocrisy over cultural relativism. And I do have that one marked, and I wanted to read that one just because it's an example of one of the ideas that the book is tangling with.
Yep.
Finkel-McGraw is talking to Hackworth and Major Napier, who's the intelligence officer.
I love Major Napier.
Finkel-McGraw says, when I was a young man, Finkel-McGraw we're told, has a bland, twangy Midwestern accent. When I was a young man, hypocrisy was deemed the worst of vices, Finkel-McGraw said. It was all because of moral relativism. You see, in that sort of climate, you're not allowed to criticize others. After all, if there is no absolute right and wrong, then what grounds is there for criticism? Finkel-McGraw paused, knowing that he had the full attention of his audience, and began to withdraw a calabash pipe and various related supplies and implements from his pockets. As he continued, he charged the calabash with a blend of leather-brown tobacco so redolent that it made Hackworth's mouth water. He was tempted to spoon some of it into his mouth. Now, this led to a good deal of general frustration, for people are naturally censorious and love nothing better than to criticize others' shortcomings. And so it was that they seized on hypocrisy and elevated it from a ubiquitous peccadillo into the monarch of all vices. For you see, even if there is no right or wrong, you can find grounds to criticize another person by contrasting what he has espoused with what he has actually done. In this case, you're not making any judgment whatsoever as to the correctness of his views or the morality of his behavior. You're merely pointing out that he has said one thing and done another. Virtually all political discourse in the days of my youth was devoted to the ferreting out of hypocrisy. You wouldn't believe the things they said about the original Victorians. Calling someone a Victorian in those days was almost like calling them a fascist or a Nazi. Both Hackworth and Major Napier were dumbfounded. "Your Grace," Napier exclaimed, "I was naturally aware that their moral stance was radically different from ours, but I am astonished to be informed that they actually condemned the first Victorians." "Of course they did," Finkel-McGraw said. "Because the first Victorians were hypocrites," Hackworth said, getting it. Finkel-McGraw beamed upon Hackworth like a master upon his favorite pupil. It's fun. When I read this, I remembered reading it the first time. And I think the first time I read it, first of all, I was kind of struck by the insight of it, which I'm now, it doesn't seem quite as surprising or intelligent to me as when I read it the first time. It seems like a misunderstanding of cultural relativism. But I also assumed, based on what I knew about Neal Stephenson, that this was Stephenson's point of view about cultural relativism too. And I think that's interesting. And I think there are other clues from time to time that Stephenson seems to at least be thoughtful about the benefits of what we might call conservatism. Although I'm also, as I'm reading this more and more, I don't necessarily think this is Stephenson's point of view. I think he's engaging with the idea. But if you think about it, Finkel-McGraw is not one of the more sympathetic characters in this book. He's impressive.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing we do know about Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw, I can't resist doing his full surname, it's just too much fun, is that he is a subversive. That we learned this early on from Hackworth when he kind of discovers, oh my God, this guy who is supposed to be this like bastion of neo-Victorian ideas is in fact subverting those very ideas. And so Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw is probably going to be wary and suspicious of having the claims of hypocrisy leveled at him. And so, which is probably why he's thinking about it and obsessed with it. And yeah, I think it is up in the air what Stevenson's point of view is, because the argument that Chung-Sik Finkel-McGraw is making is that it is foolish to simply level the claim at somebody that they are bad because they are hypocrites, because what that does is that allows you to sidestep the meat and potatoes of their actual argument or their desire to what they're doing in the world. Right. Stevenson is probably looking at her own particular era, where one of the worst attacks you can make on your political opponent is that they are a flip-flopper. Right. Which is a great way to not have to say anything yourself in terms of your own particular policy ideas. Yeah. And I struggle with this because this is a well-honed tool of conservative thinking is to be like, no, all of you are simply splitting hairs. You're getting lost in the details of you said this and you said that, and you're sort of doing kind of like verbal taxonomy.
Legalism, right.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the woke revolution is simply interested in defining this and that so they can say what we can say and not say. And that is as specious an argument as what they are leveling a claim against, which I am also willing to think about some of those claims as perhaps specious.
I think that I read this 20 years ago and I don't remember reading it, but when I hit this passage again, I was like, oh, I think this really kind of did influence my thinking a little bit, because now to this day, I'm a little bit wary of simply there's a lot of, Twitter style argument that's just like, Ron DeSantis, great example. Ron DeSantis is calling for aid to Florida now, but he voted against aid to New Jersey in 2012 or something like that. And it's like, well, does that mean he's wrong now? Or that what he's calling for, which is helping people who've been struck by a hurricane, is a bad idea? I mean, maybe it is useful to point out the hypocrisy in some context or another, but if you're simply evaluating an idea is a good idea or a bad idea regardless of the person espousing it is a hypocrite or not.
Yeah. I think what you're bringing up is the difference between good faith and bad faith.
Right.
And
right.
And I think, George Orwell would agree with you that there's bad faith hypocrisy. And then good faith hypocrisy, which is that people are complicated and that the world is complicated. And holding somebody to everything they have said forever is is sort of bad faith, because you are not allowing any kind of, that is I do not want to live in that world. Unfortunately, I think we do, but that is a world where nuance can exist, and people can't change, and that is that's unfortunate.
And if you're trying to determine whether Finkel-McGraw is a good faith or a bad faith actor when he's making this argument, it's all a kind of Victorian subtextual setup, blackmailing and bribing, stick and carrot Hackworth to spy on Dr. X, who we come to learn, although maybe up to some bad things, is also trying to do something that seems like a pretty good thing for 250,000 children who desperately need some help. So it's interesting. I don't know how Finkel-McGraw is going to come across by the end of this book, but it's one of the things I'm going to be reading for. Right now, I'm putting him on the sort of not such a great guy side of things. There's another observation about Finkel-McGraw that Hackworth makes at one point too, which is that the really wealthy, successful people aren't necessarily any smarter than Hackworth. They just have a personality that makes them more successful, which is the thing that he thinks the primer, the magical book, is going to solve for his daughter, is going to give her the personality of a winner, of somebody who starts businesses, who tries, who takes risk, which, and one is reminded, say, of Elon Musk, right, who is a brilliant engineer, I think, but or other billionaires these days who aren't necessarily, don't always seem that smart, but definitely have gumption, and their gumption got them somewhere. Again, Stephenson seems pretty prescient with this book, I think.
My God, yeah.
Let's get your passage in. I have a very short paragraph I want to read too, and then we can go to the trivia.
This is the name of this chapter is Hackworth compiles the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, particulars of the underlying technology, and it's it's probably about 10 or 15 paragraphs deep. The universe was a disorderly mess, the only interesting bits being the organized anomalies. Hackworth had once taken his family out rowing on the pond in the park, and the ends of the yellow oars spun off compact vortices, and Fiona, who had taught herself the physics of liquids through numerous experimental beverage spills and in the bathtub, demanded an explanation for these holes in the water. She leaned over the gunwale, Gwendolen holding the sash of her dress, and felt those vortices with her hands, wanting to understand them. The rest of the pond, simply water in no particular order, was uninteresting. We ignore the blackness of outer space and pay attention to the stars, especially if they seem to order themselves into constellations. Common as the air meant something worthless, but Hackworth knew that every breath of air that Fiona drew, lying in her little bed at night, just a silver glow in the moonlight, was used by her body to make skin and hair and bones. The air became Fiona, and deserving, no, demanding, of love. Ordering matter was the sole endeavor of life, whether it was a jumble of self-replicating molecules in the primordial ocean, or a steam-powered English mill turning weeds into clothing, or Fiona lying in her bed, turning air into Fiona. My God.
I mean, if Stephenson is not a father at this point, where does he, I mean, you just, the book is just dripping with an awareness of a father's devotion to a child and how powerful a motivating force can be. I mean, Hackworth is pretty one-dimensional in that regard. He seems to have no other desires that we know of, right? Yeah, it's really lovely. It's poetic, too. I mean, it almost is like you could reformat it as a sonnet or something like that.
Yeah,
it's
gorgeous. And just the I mean, you learn so much about Hackworth's. It's one of those passages in a book that does the double duty that all of us as writers that are hoping to achieve, which is character elucidation through moving prose. Like it's just, I mean, it just astonishes me, and manages to also capture and recapitulate the themes that I think Stephenson is scattering throughout the book. It's, as a piece of craft, I just adore those two paragraphs.
They stood out for me too. Yeah, it's quite lovely.
What is yours?
Well, I'm going to set it up a little bit, which is, and we both talked about how this book flew a little bit under the radar. It was a successful book, I think, right? It wasn't like Zodiac, which didn't make much of a splash. Like, this was not considered a failure, but it is sandwiched between Snow Crash and Cryptonomicon, which were both massive hits, and it didn't achieve that status. And I think part of it is that it was seen, I believe this was right around the time that the term steampunk was coming into vogue, and it was seen as like another steampunk novel. And even if you think about it, starting with Bud and the Skull Gun, it also kind of feels very William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, original, just another cyberpunk novel, but with neo-Victorian, so it's a little bit steampunk. It feels like maybe it was treated like pastiche, but I'm thinking about the DNA of this novel, and like, there are three Victorian era writers who stand out to me that all feel like they shaped the book. And one is Charles Dickens, obviously. Another, actually, maybe even more so, is Mark Twain, because the plot really reminds me of The Prince and the Pauper, which I think we always think of as a Dickens book, but it's actually Mark Twain sort of writing like Dickens, I think, in a way. And then the other writer it kind of reminds me of actually is Arthur Conan Doyle, and especially Judge Fang and some of his machinations. A lot of the nanosites in this book, plot-wise, function kind of like the Baker Street Irregulars,
you're right. Oh my God.
They're kind of like roaming around, gathering intelligence for our various investigators. So this is when Bud has figured out that the Ashantis are hunting him for what he did to one of their number, and he's trying to evade them, and he's kind of nervous. Very soon after that, Bud swapped clothes with an indigent down on the beach, giving up all his black leather and coming away with a T-shirt and shorts of his own. The T-shirt was much too small. It bound him under the armpits and pressed against his muscles so that he felt the eternal twitching even more than usual. He wished he could turn the stimulators off for now, relax his muscles even for one night, but that would require a trip to the mod parlor. He had to figure the Ashanti had the mod parlors all staked out. He could have gone to any of several brothels, but he didn't know what kind of connections these Ashanti might have, or even what the hell an Ashanti was exactly, and he wasn't sure he could get a boner under these circumstances anyway. Here's the sentence I love. As he wandered the streets of the leased territories, primed to level his sights at any black person who blundered into his path, he reflected on the unfairness of his fate. How was he to know that that guy belonged to a tribe? I love, as he wandered the streets of the leased territories, interjection, primed to level his sights at any black person who blundered into his path, comma, he reflected on the unfairness of his fate. That is a Arthur Conan Doyle sentence, actually. I think it's something Doyle did a lot. Reading Sherlock Holmes as a kid, I didn't really notice it. But going back and reading some of the Sherlock Holmes stories later, you see Holmes is often insulting the people around him, but he's doing it in these sort of subtle ways that the people who are being insulted don't always pick up on. The other writer, actually, it reminds me of, who does this a lot, is Patrick O'Brian, who wrote the Aubrey Matrin novels. I don't think you've read Patrick O'Brian, but I know your father
Not yet.
is quite a fan. If we continue this podcast, we want to do some Aubrey Matrin, Patrick O'Brian. O'Brian is often doing this thing where he'll point out some hypocrisy or stupidity of his characters in a sentence like that one, where the reader is supposed to pick up on it, but the character is oblivious to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, this is a book in a lot of ways that plays with the ideas of hypocrisy, and I think I would guess that Stephenson has dealt throughout his career with hasty accusations about his own particular beliefs. Mm-hmm. And I think what he's chosen to do is to assemble a whole bunch of ideas in the arena of his books and let us do what we are doing, and wrestle with them. And like God bless you, Neal Stephenson, for doing that, for doing what a writer does best, which is elucidate interesting ideas in moving ways for us to encounter in sentences just like that one that you just read, which are enjoyable and important.
Yeah, yeah.
So, I actually wrote this out. And yes, we are going wait style. So this is a multiple choice.
Okay.
During the discussion that you brought up about hypocrisy between Chung Sik Finkel McGraw, Major Napier, and John Percival Hackworth, John Percival Hackworth eats a steak sandwich upon which he puts something called McWhorter's Original Condiment. Which of the following three options are not in the masterful list of ingredients that Stephenson trots out for us to read? So 2 of these are real. Your job is to pick out the one that is not in that list.
Got it.
Option A, uranium mill tailings. Option B, nutria. Option C, autumn leaves.
I think it's nutria.
You are correct. And excellent work, because there is a section in the middle where I was convinced nutria were going to show up, where he says nitrates, nitrites, nitrotes, and nitrutes, nitrites, natrotes, powdered pork nose hairs, but never nutria. Will you suffer me reading the list?
Go ahead. I very much enjoyed this list too. Although I only read it once, so I didn't cram for that. We're talking nutria, the giant rodents, right?
I figured that I was like, you know what? That's a plausible entry into this list that might stump
I couldn't
Justin.
quite remember if autumn leaves were in there. I definitely remembered the uranium mill tailings, and then I sort of vaguely recalled. It was interesting. I didn't remember the phrase autumn leaves, but I vaguely recalled imagining the taste of autumn leaves.
And the song. It's a song. It's an important jazz standard. And I was like, God damn it, Stephenson.
Oh, really?
You're amazing. Oh, yeah, it's a wonderful song. It's
autumn
beautiful.
leaves or the sauce. What's the name of the sauce?
The sauce is McWhorter's Original Condiment, but autumn leaves is in fact a jazz standard.
I mean, to me, it's clearly based on Heinz brown sauce, and the first 3 ingredients were pretty faithful. It's like molasses.
It's like the first 9 or so are very plausible. But it goes, if the manifest of ingredients on the bottle had been legible, it would have read something like this: water, blackstrap molasses, imported habanero peppers, salt, garlic, ginger, tomato puree, axle grease, real hickory smoke, snuff, butts of clove cigarettes, Guinness stout fermentation dregs, uranium mill tailings, muffler cores, monosodium glutamate, nitrates, nitrites, nitrotes, and nitrutes, nitrites, natrotes, powdered pork nose hairs, dynamite, activated charcoal, match heads, used pipe cleaners, tar, nicotine, single malt whiskey, smoked beef lymph nodes, autumn leaves, red fuming nitric acid, bituminous coal, fallout, printer's ink, laundry starch, drain cleaner, blue chrysotile asbestos, carrageenan, BHA, BHT, and natural flavorings.
A few callbacks of Zodiac there with the activated charcoal and probably some of the other compounds as well.
Totally. Yeah. I can't, I love lists and books. You can't not think of the list in Lolita when Humbert is looking at Dolores's list of students, in which Dolores Hayes is suspended about a third of the way down, and at the end, Humbert goes, "A poem, forsooth, a poem." And this is the same, it's at the same level of just, it's amazing. It's funny and fun, but at the same time, it is telling and important and interesting.
Do you think that we're supposed to understand that this is Hackworth's sort of like whimsical imagination as he's munching on this, or is it just the author inserting himself in the book,
I think
basically taking like a little guitar solo, being like nitrates?
I think lists usually are. I think it's the effluvia that bounces around in writers' brains, and they're like, I can't fucking put this anywhere else. And I've got to get rid of this like energy, and they do, and it's I don't know. Lists are Ian Fraser is another amazing list maker, and one worthy of everybody's reading.
So a couple moments in the book, I believe in the very first sentence, and also towards the end of the first half, there's a reference to the bells at St. Mark's ringing changes. Do you know what ringing changes means? And I have multiple choice if you want. If you want to take a guess without multiple, okay.
My guess would be that it rings the prayers between matins and vespers, but I'm not sure.
Okay, well, let me give you the three options then.
Okay.
If you, that's not one of the options, so okay. I'll just go ahead and say, although it's similar to one of the options. It refers to a notation system of bell ringing requiring several ringers, where each ringer is responsible for one bell, and the notation indicates chord changes and arpeggio patterns for a particular song. So each ringer trains to learn whether or not their bell is part of a particular chord for that particular key. So if that makes sense, I can explain it again. But that's
I got it. I mean, basically, we're talking about the bell playing sort of as like chord changes on a chart.
Chord changes on a chart. B, it refers to a particular melody, sort of like what you were describing earlier, played on a carillon, which is a keyboard that controls bells mechanically. So it can be played by one person can play multiple bells. Similar to Vespers, a call for prayer, but in this case indicating the changing of the watch, which traditionally happens at midnight, 8 a.m., and 4 p.m. Ringing the changes of the watch, or ringing changes. Or C, again, a system of bell ringing, where each ringer controls a bell and then rings them according to an order that shifts based on mathematical patterns. Let me know if you want me to give them to you again, because that was a little bit complicated.
No, I think I got them. B feels like a good invention, but the fact of like a changing of a watch at a church is a little odd. I am going to go with A.
It's C.
Ah!
And you've probably heard it if you've walked around an old college campus, a lot of old college campus. Whenever you hear like ringing bells, where you're like, "What the hell is that?" That's not. It'll be like ding dong 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 ding dong dong ding 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 dong dong dong. It sounds very chaotic, and then every now and again something really beautiful will emerge from it, which actually I believe the second time we hear about it, there's a description that Stephenson gives, kind of like what I just gave, which is that but yeah, and it'll be like each bell ringer has a number, and then if you look at the notation of it, it's actually really interesting. It's kind of like a sestina. It'll just be like, this time ring 1 6 5 4 3 2 2 1, and next time ring like 1, 3, 2, 4, 5, 7. And those, they'll sort of draw those out on a grid, and then the patterns will basically be kind of like shapes. So it's like the person who's designing the patterns of the rings probably doesn't know what they're going to sound like the first time, unless they're like a Mozart level genius who can hear it in their head. The mathematical drawings are sort of like the inspiration, and then they're enacted by the ringers. So why don't you say what's coming up next, and I will do our farewell.
Next time, dear listener, we will be considering at least the second half of the Diamond Age and anything else that we decide to talk about.
Great. Thank you all for listening. As always, we would love a 5-star rating. If you want to if you have something critical to say, you can go ahead and send us an email. For now, you can send it to jpd@uppermiddlebrow.com or bagg@uppermiddlebrow.com. And we'll see you next time.
Are you someone who loved reading as a child, but the magic of it was lost amongst a combination of outrage, fuel, social media, adulting, and the rise of fascism? Or maybe you were that student who enjoyed reading The Great Gatsby, but got stuck with an English teacher who was phoning it in until she could start day drinking. Or maybe you're a left-brained person cursed with right-brained friends and would, just once, like to understand the greater context of that book they're all talking about over brunch. Or maybe you're all three, like me. If so, then do I have the podcast for you. In a world full of consumers that can't sit through a 30-second Netflix intro without hitting skip, Jesse and Chris managed to do the impossible. They keep your attention. Through a combination of engaging banter, bias-conscious discussions, humble wit, and genuine knowledge, the hosts share their passions for an eclectic mix of media that is approachable for the rest of us. Upper Middlebrow is a disarming excavation that reveals what is artful about everyday works of art. Their secret, they stand aside, leave their egos at the door, and let the art do the work. Their refreshing enthusiasm for often intimidating topics is infectious. You may even be tempted to stand on your desk and cry out, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," after a listen. My thanks to the hosts for being the cool English teachers I was always told existed, but never managed to find for myself. That's a review from Welsh Wormling, and thank you so much, Welsh Wormling, for your kind words and for your continued enthusiasm. We couldn't do it without readers like you. Other listeners, if you feel compelled to leave us a review as well, a review like Welsh Wormlings with a 5-star rating really, really helps other people find the show. So please do so wherever you found us. Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes, creators and hosts. Music from Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com. Thanks for listening.